For a long time, divine words echoed among men, revealing secrets that transcend human understanding and illuminate the ways of those seeking the truth. Amid the sacred pages and the writings of great sages, there is a promise that, even after centuries, remains current and provocative: God's promise on wealth. This account begins with the remembrance of a time when kings, priests, and pastors walked side by side, each in his mission, but all united by the same desire to understand the divine mysteries. In a small town, located between hills and serene rivers, a man whose faith and determination was inspired by those around him. His words, based on the teachings of Scripture, resonated with the conviction that God always fulfills what he promises. He tirelessly studied sacred texts, consulting from the Psalms, which exalted the Creator's generosity and abundance, to the writings of the Old Testament sages, where deep lessons about spiritual and material prosperity were found. This man, who was not only a scholar, but also an example of life, understood that true wealth goes beyond gold and silver. It manifests itself in faith, hope, and in the practice of love of neighbor. Among the echoes of ancient stories, there is an episode reported in the writings of the ancient sages that echoes hard in our day. In the midst of difficulty and scarcity, God would have promised a miraculous transformation, where genuine faith would open the doors to an abundance that is not meant only on earthly goods, but in the fullness of life. Sacred books and treated from renowned theologians corroborate this view, stating that prosperity is, first of all, a divine blessing that manifests itself in those who trust in the providence of the Lord. In traveling the writings of the ancient shepherds, it is noted that his words always invited reflection. It was necessary to abandon the narrow view of materialism to embrace the generosity of a heart that recognizes God's hand in every detail. Writings of the parents of the Church and the mystics of the Middle Ages pointed out that true wealth was a gift that flowed from above, being cultivated through service, humility, and unshakable faith. This promise, so bold and charming, invited everyone to rethink their values and to seek a life of meaning, where prosperity became a reflection of divine grace. Remembering this man who lived among us, it is impossible not to feel a mix of astonishment and admiration. His words were established in the conviction that the Creator never leaves those who serve him with an open heart. In his teachings, he cited passages that illustrated how the Lord's generosity revealed himself in times of greatest challenge. And although he faced trials that tested his faith, he found in Scripture the sustenance to move on, convinced that the promise of divine abundance was real and transformative. This narrative unfolds in a context where the understanding of prosperity extends beyond appearances and ephemeral goods. In the words of the ancient shepherds, wealth was understood as a manifestation of divine goodness that extended to those who devoted themselves to practicing justice and charity. In revisiting passages from the sacred books, there is the memory that the Lord is my pastor, nothing will lack, Psalm 23, an expression that transcends the simple act of providing and enters the terrain of certainty that true faith results in divine provision for each need. In a time of great challenges, when hunger and uncertainty seemed to dominate the land, there were reports that demonstrated how God's promise on wealth manifested in a surprising way. Historical and written documents of renowned theologians bring reports from communities that even in the midst of scarcity have experienced a miracle of abundance. These communities, guided by the teachings of the shepherds, found in prayer and in the practice of good a safe way to receive divine blessing. Each gesture of kindness and every act of faith were interpreted as seeds planted in the fertile soil of trust in God. Scientists and scholars of religious traditions have dedicated their efforts to understanding how these principles also apply to our day. Comparative studies between the various spiritual traditions show that the idea of prosperity as a divine gift is not restricted to a single culture or time, but permeates the essence of the human being in his search for meaning. The words of the wise, echoed in theological treatises and in historical essays, suggest that faith, coupled with correct action, can turn even the most adverse situations into opportunities for growth and renewal. In revisiting these texts, it is clear that the teachings about divine wealth were transmitted with an eloquence that today inspires us to rethink our own vision of prosperity. The Creator's generosity, revealed through the miracle and measures that occur in the most unexpected moments, invites each individual to recognize that, even during the difficulty of difficulty, the promise of abundance remains firm and unshakable. This account, impregnated with historical examples and interpretations of great scholars, reveals that God's message is always a call to personal and collective transformation. And while the words of the ancient shepherds continue to guide the steps of many, the certainty that divine providence is present on each journey remains as current as in the days before the birth of our faith. In the teaching of this narrative, characters arose whose lives were marked by experiences that power the divine promise in a powerful way. Among them stands out the figure of a man who, even facing devastating losses, found in the revival of faith the reason to transform his reality. His steps led him to places where despair seemed to reign, but with each new difficulty, he gathered himself to the scriptures, finding in them the confirmation that God's promised wealth is not merely material, but manifests itself in restoration and overcoming the obstacles of life. This man's account is widely documented in old manuscripts and comments from scholars who have dedicated their lives to studying miracles and divine interventions. These reports show us that the promise of prosperity is often revealed in the form of reconciliation and renewal. He, with his experience, demonstrated that the power of faith manifests himself when he fully trusts himself in divine orientation, allowing the light of the Creator to illuminate to the darker paths. In his words, they echoed teachings that referred to the teachings of the pastors who preceded him, bridged between the old and the modern, between tradition and contemporaneity. The wealth God has promised is portrayed in a multifaceted way. There is financial abundance, but there is also spiritual prosperity, which is reflected in the ability to forgive, to love, and to transform the environment around. Historical writings and theological studies point out that this duality is fundamental to understanding the totality of the divine gift. Internal transformation and spiritual rebirth are presented as the true signs of God's intervention in the lives of men. At a time when materialism seemed to take care of the hearts, the message of this man and the ancient shepherds rescued the value of soul and communion with the divine. Within this context, the influence of important figures on religious history cannot be underestimated. Authors who have analyzed the trajectory of the great spiritual leaders reveal that true wealth is the one that transforms, heals, and unites. This narrative is reflected in events marked by miracles and measures that challenged human explanations. In reporting these episodes, scholars often mention how, in times of great adversity, the simple act of trusting God became the catalyst for an unexpected turn, where scarcity turned into abundance. It is amazing to note how this message remains alive over the centuries. The man who faced unimaginable losses found in faith a way to raise not only his life, but also that of the whole community around him. His teachings, based on sacred texts, invited the listeners to reflect on the true meaning of prosperity. Each account, each lesson, was proof that God's promised wealth is not conditioned on external circumstances, but available to each human being to open to the miracle of faith. In advancing this journey through the records of faith, it is evident that divine promises about wealth are also an invitation to social and collective transformation. In several ancient communities, the practice of solidarity and the sharing of goods were seen as direct manifestations of God's grace. Writings of theologians and historians show that when individuals joined around values such as justice and love, prosperity manifested in a surprising way. This union not only strengthened community ties, but also created an environment where the miracle of abundance could be accomplished, transforming the pain of inequality into renewed hope. The words of the ancient shepherds were clear in emphasizing that the true divine gift lies in the ability to transform the collective. It was not just a personal blessing, but a promise that involved the whole of society. When members of a community surrendered to the practice of charity and the search for a greater ideal, they witnessed God's invisible hand operating to distribute riches of often unimaginable ways. This perspective is reflected in historical texts that narrate the recovery of entire cities, whose residents, through faith and joint work, reached a prosperity that overcome the difficulties imposed by destiny. In a deep analysis of these events, several scholars point out that social transformation has always been a reflection of divine intervention. In times of crisis, when resources seemed exhausted, unity and solidarity were the ingredients that made the way for renewal. This phenomenon is described in various theological and historical treatises, where collective faith becomes the pillar for reconstruction and for the emergence of new opportunities. History teaches that true wealth is one that multiplies when shared, and that every act of goodness is a reflection of commitment to divine truth and justice. In the midst of this scenario, it is important to highlight the influence of leaders who, with their example, inspired not only individual faith, but also the commitment to the common good. These leaders, always grounded in Scripture, recalled that God's promised abundance was a gift that should be celebrated and shared. And sometimes in community meetings, the opportunity arose to hear a special call, that each person would comment on his own experience and even mention the city from which he was watching the message, in a gesture that approached and strengthened the bonds among the faithful. This practice proved to be a way of recognizing the divine presence in every corner of the earth, making faith a living and shared experience. God's promise on wealth, when examined through time, reveals a complexity that goes beyond the simple understanding of what it is to have financial abundance. In the interpretations of the great sages, this promise unfolds into multiple dimensions: the prosperity of the spirit, the flowering of the community, and the renewal of human relations. Several writings of both ancient pastors and contemporary scholars emphasize that true wealth is a gift that is reflected in the ability to transform lives. It becomes visible in a child's smile, reconciliation between old enemies, and the renewed hope of a people who, despite adversity, trusts in divine providence. The narrative of life of a man who intensely lived this transformation is a notorious example of this principle. After years of difficulties and suffering that seemed to have no end, his turnaround was marked by a deep encounter with the teachings of Scripture. He came to understand that God's promised wealth was not merely the sum of material goods, but the manifestation of a new way of seeing existence. In his speeches, he cited passages that referred to a worldview where faith served as the foundation for change. Among the texts that inspired his thinking was the memory that "the Lord is my pastor, nothing will lack," a constant reminder that the divine presence is synonymous with provision and care. Throughout his teachings, this man emphasized that each challenge was an opportunity to grow and to approach the divine essence. He stated that by recognizing the interconnection between material and spiritual prosperity, each could find on his own journey the key to unlocking an abundance that would benefit not only himself, but the whole community. This teaching, which echoes through the centuries, is supported by various treatises and texts of scholars who point out that genuine faith is the way to turn the ordinary into extraordinary. The impact of this vision of wealth is palpable not only on historical accounts, but also on the personal experience of many who, when hearing this message, came to see their lives from a new perspective. In recognizing divine providence, these individuals found strength to overcome barriers and rebuild their realities. Every act of faith, every demonstration of love for neighbor, was interpreted as a brick in the building of a future where hope and prosperity intertwined. This is the message that remains alive, that true wealth is in living according to divine precepts and sharing the abundance that comes from above. As the echoes of this story propagate, it is clear that the divine call to prosperity manifests itself in a unique way in human experience. Each chapter of this account reflects the belief that God, in His infinite wisdom, never leaves those who seek Him with sincerity. The personal and community transformation, marked by acts of faith and solidarity, is a living testimony that the promise on wealth transcends materialism and is rooted in the essence of the human being. In revisiting the ancient writings and testimonies of transformed lives, it is evident that God's message of abundance is a constant invitation to renewal. This message, recorded in both Psalms and the teachings of the great shepherds, reminds us that true prosperity is built based on faith, action, and sharing. The experience of communities that have overcome crises through mutual commitment illustrates that when each person is willing to contribute to the common good, the miracle of divine providence becomes reality. The narrative of a man who reinvented himself after dark times reinforces this idea. His trajectory was marked by challenges that, instead of overthrowing him, propelled him to seek guidance from the sacred texts. He understood that God's wealth manifests Himself surprisingly when He aligns his heart with divine principles. This realization echoes in various historical accounts and the writings of scholars who analyze the miracles of divine providence, demonstrating that true faith is not static, but a continuous engine. As this message spreads, each person who hears this story is invited to reflect on his own journey and to recognize the presence of the divine in his daily life. In the midst of daily challenges, the call to comment, for example, the city from which you are watching the message, becomes a symbolic gesture of belonging and recognition that, regardless of the place, God's promise reaches all the corners of the earth. This interaction reinforces the idea that faith is a collective experience, where each individual account adds to a greater testimony of love and hope. In concluding this account, it is evident that God's promised wealth is much more than the simple accumulation of goods. It is the maximum expression of divine generosity, an invitation for each one to turn and transform the world around them. This narrative, based on the sacred texts and the teachings of the great shepherds, reaffirms that true prosperity is born of faith, commitment to the good, and certainty that the Creator never fails in His promises. This narrative runs through the trajectory of a divine promise on wealth, based on Scripture and the teachings of the ancient shepherds. History reveals that true prosperity manifests itself in the union between faith and the practice of good, transforming not only individual lives, but whole communities. Historical and written reports of theologians illustrate that even in times of extreme difficulty, confidence in God can convert scarcity into abundance. The account of a man who overcame personal challenges by embracing this faith reinforces the idea that true wealth lies in the transformation of the spirit and commitment to justice. Finally, the message invites each listener to recognize their own experience of this divine abundance, even remembering to comment on the city from where it is watching, demonstrating that providence reaches all corners.